Okay, hello everyone. My name is Yuru Liu. I'm a professor in the Pure Mathematics department. I'm also the director of the Women in Mathematics Committee. Welcome to our Entrepreneurship and Impact series. Before we go any further, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people. Our main campus is situated on the Hardman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that include 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campus through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Office of Indigenous Relations. Today, we are joined by Bonnie Foy-Wang. Bonnie currently leads substantial investments in Canada at Mercy, one of the world's largest investment consulting and asset management firms. Bonnie is also a member of the Direct Investment Committee of the Atmospheric Fund, an organization which invests in urban solutions to reduce greenhouse gases. She has founded Peck Ventures, which invests in 8 women-led technology ventures. Bonnie has received many awards, including the University of Waterloo Faculty of Math Alumni Achievement Award, a Startup Canada Entrepreneur Promotion Award, and a YMCA Women of Distinguished Award for Entrepreneurship and Innovation in recognition of Peck Ventures' impact. Bonnie has also led the investment strategy for not-for-profit $300 million investment program, financed over $1 billion in private capital in Europe and North America, and advised business as a corporate finance advisor and auditor. Without further ado, I invite you to join me in welcoming Bonnie.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Melissa, Nancy, Stephanie, Charlie, who is floating around here somewhere, for inviting me to speak here today. I'm Bonnie Foy-Wang, and I'm currently Sustainable Investment Leader at Mercer, where we're advising pension funds, endowments, foundations, and insurance companies on how to integrate sustainability and ESG factors into their investment approach to help them achieve their financial, strategic, and sustainability objectives. That's what I do by day. If you have looked up my background on LinkedIn, there is a lot on me in the public domain. You can read up about my background, but I won't go through line by line what my career journey has been. But what you might notice is that I do have a multidisciplinary background. I've tried a lot of different things as I have navigated my career to try to find the different and maybe best places to make use of my skills, to have the most impact in the world that I can, and to really try to get closer to how decisions are made. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes just sharing some highlights from my career journey, sharing a bit from the different disciplines that I've had the privilege of working in, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and an Ask Me Anything session towards the end. What I wanted to open with was a brief introduction highlighting some defining moments in my career. And there have been many, but I tried to narrow it down to about 3 or 4 that were life-changing. I wanted to make a connection between my academic background here at Waterloo, and how I gained my entrepreneurial skills. I also wanted to touch upon the core thing that really stitches my career together, which is around influencing decisions and how people make decisions, particularly where there's a lot of uncertainty. I then wanted to focus a bit, because this is an entrepreneurship, impact, and innovation series. I wanted to focus a bit on my entrepreneurial journey and what it was like to start something, as well as what it means to forge your own path and there's a bit of a caveat in that, as well as to spend some time on what it was like to deal with challenges or obstacles over the course of my career. And lastly, I'll close with more on sustainability and sustainable investment. I'll forewarn you, it's a little bit of a chaotic part because sustainability is really vast, but I have decided to close on that, and we'll see where that takes us. So I started off my career, I was going to be a chartered accountant. I studied math and accounting here at Waterloo, and my first co-op job was with Deloitte. And that is what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I was going to be an auditor. But after graduating, the first life-changing decision that I made was to move to the UK with Deloitte. It was purely based on curiosity. I was born and raised in Toronto. I'd only ever lived in Canada. And there's something, I cannot quite put my finger on it, but something that I was curious about. I wanted to know what it was like to live and work somewhere else. My parents were dead set against it. They were immigrants to Canada, and they couldn't quite comprehend why I would want to leave a comfortable job in Toronto to go and live in one of the most expensive cities in the world. But I went anyways. And it set a path for me which was very much led by curiosity, very much led by things that were unknown and maybe even a little bit scary. I had this tendency of leaning towards things that I didn't quite fully understand, that had a lot of uncertainty and was just a little bit, I was a little bit fearful of. That was one of the first life-changing decisions I made. And when I was in the UK, fast forward a bit, one of the second defining moments and life-changing moments was when I left what was a corporate career to forge a path in entrepreneurship and impact. And I make this face because it was like this dual shift that I was making. In hindsight, I don't know what I was thinking. Entrepreneurship is hard. Trying to do something with positive impact is hard as well. But around 2008, 2009, about 15 years ago, I made this shift where I wanted to integrate more impact in what I was doing. And the only way I knew that I could do it at the time was to forge my own path. Call it naive. My mom would have called it stubborn. In my mind, it was the only way that I could do it because I didn't see around me the kind of company or the kind of environment that I wanted to work in, so I decided I have to create it myself. And I'll be honest, I had, in hindsight, like equal measures of great pride in doing this, and also a little bit of incredulity. It was like, what was I thinking? I had no idea what I was doing. I had very little resource. I had some resources, but in hindsight, I feel like I didn't have as much resources or as much of a safety net as I would have liked to do this. But it did force me to be resourceful, and it forced me to reach out, ask for help, learn the things that I needed to learn to be more successful as an entrepreneur. It did take a couple of goes. I'll be honest about that. I can be honest about this now, but back then it was very much sort of painting a picture of like, I'm going to use what I knew from my corporate background, from my time at Deloitte, from my time in investment banking, and I am going to help innovative, impact-oriented companies and entrepreneurs raise the finance that they needed for their ventures. And some entrepreneurs actually trusted me to give them this advice. In the early years, I was learning at the same time as advising others as they embarked on their own journey. And so some of the things, so that was like the second life-changing, career-defining moment was making this shift and embarking on my own entrepreneurial path. Another life-changing moment that I feel so privileged to have experienced was, so I was in the UK for 12 years, after graduating from Waterloo. And I returned to Canada eventually, but I moved to Vancouver first before returning to Toronto. And I'm so glad that I did, because in Vancouver, there was this interesting mix of sort of an impact orientation. There were like so many communities of people who were really focused on measures of success that went beyond financial. You know, what was it like to ensure that there was actually justice in finance? What was it like to, you know, focus more on some of those social measures of success? What was it like to do things as part of a community? And this combination of that kind of environment in Vancouver with my entrepreneurial journey, with this focus on impact, was an incredible mix of ingredients. And I still carry those values and those lessons learned with me. And I'm still reminded about those principles by a lot of my friends. I'll say a little bit more about that because it was very critical, having started Peak Ventures in Vancouver, what it was like to do that within that community. And then the fourth life-changing or defining moment was returning to Toronto after having been away for 2 decades. I was coming back to my roots. I was coming back to living close to my family after being away for so long, having essentially been on my own and self-sufficient, to suddenly being so close to where I grew up, but now having understanding of the context in which I grew up, having traveled and worked around the world. And I've had to kind of come to terms with, you know, growing up without a lot of resources. Growing up without the exposure to all these different opportunities and all these different people. I had no idea investment banking even existed when I grew up in Toronto. I had no idea what venture capital was. I had no idea what institutional investing or sustainable investment were. But now I was back in Toronto, living 2 kilometers southeast from where I had grown up, literally on the other side of the tracks. And I was no longer a student. I now had this wealth of experience, this wealth of international experience. And now it was my time to apply it. And it was no longer about me creating things or modeling things, but like, how do I build teams to do this? How do I build community to do this? How do I come to terms with where I've come from now that this is where I am? Maybe more on that later. So I wanted to touch a bit about like the connection between math and entrepreneurship, because when I was studying here, I was going to be an accountant. I had no idea what entrepreneurship was. One could argue being an accountant is the complete opposite. Like, accountants look backwards at what has already happened. Accountants worry about risk. I'm still surrounded by people who worry about risk. Entrepreneurs are forward-looking and future-looking. Entrepreneurs think about the opportunities as well as reducing the risk. But in hindsight, what math helped me do is have that curiosity mindset, have that sense of solving a problem even though there is risk and uncertainty. And I was never really that good at memorizing things, and maybe one could argue I was a little bit lazy about studying all the facts. What I loved about math is that if I had a model or a framework, it wasn't just one problem that I could solve many. And I do this to this day. Like, again, my multidisciplinary background, like, I end up making every problem kind of look the same. Like, I walk around saying like it's essentially the same problem, but just in a different way. And so math wasn't just about studying statistics or probabilities or learning how to program or even learning finance and tax and audit. It was learning how to solve problems. It was learning how to gather information, connect the dots, and use that to communicate something, to tell a story in numbers, to help make sense of the world for others. And as I said, it took a few goes to really learn or understand how to apply what I knew in an entrepreneurial context. Which brings me to the core thing that I absolutely love doing, and the thing that's been common in all the different things that I've done, and that is how to influence decisions, particularly where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I've learned that it's numbers are really powerful. Numbers and math is really useful for creating order when there's a lot of chaos. But it isn't the full picture. At the end of the day, emotions drive decisions. And like we have these models which essentially help to tell us, okay, you know, this kind of outcome based on our reference point is good. You should feel good about that. But on the flip side, we have reference points which tell us that certain numbers, oh, like that's not a good thing. And so you might feel bad about that. And that is ultimately what drives decisions. I also learned on my journey, you know, this concept of entrepreneurial intuition. And the same goes for whether you're an investor or not, right? Someone I had met, another investor had said, there's no such thing as a future fact. We can't analyze something that hasn't happened yet. So we have to fill in the gaps. We have to use our intuition to fill in those gaps of uncertainty. Intuition is another input. And so this actually features in a book that I wrote like some 7, 8 years ago now. Because to make optimal decisions, we need to be incorporating analytical information, emotions, also like our physical state when we're making decisions impacts the decisions we make, as well as intuition to fill in those gaps where there's a lot of uncertainty. And it became really core to the way that I did things, particularly on my entrepreneurial journey, because there was so much uncertainty. And I learned that I had to use my intuition to identify, you know, where was that future opportunity? Where were the gaps? How could I come up with a solution to solve problems where those solutions hadn't existed before? So on that note around, you know, what does it take to start something? I'm actually in the middle of possibly a second book where I had started to interview other VCs, predominantly women, to ask them, you know, what did it take for you to start your fund? And, you know, sometimes I say to folks, like, sometimes to start something, like you really just literally have to start. You may not have all the pieces, you may not know everything that you need to know, but taking that first step enables you to gather more information, to move to that next safe space, gather more information and inputs, to then be able to make a decision to take the next step. I felt that way about the company that I started, Peak Ventures. I learned so much simply from starting, simply from putting an idea out into the universe and into my community, more literally, and inviting people to be a part of it. When I started my company, it was a hybrid consulting firm, but really my aim was to start a fund. And so I started Peak Ventures as like a management company that would stand up what is now Peak Fund. And I had a hypothesis around what I would invest in. I was going to invest in impact-oriented ventures and skew towards backing women-founded companies. But I had to find investors. I didn't have enough money of my own to invest. So I had to convince other people to invest in this fund with me. And the only way that I could do that was simply to start, to put the idea out there and invite people to be investors. That had enormous impact because it was very public. Like, I literally hung my hat out there to say, I am starting this fund. It was one of the first impact funds on the West Coast in like a decade or so. And whilst there was a growing ecosystem of startup investing, Peak Fund was one of the first to integrate impact into that approach. And there's a number of investors, most of them women, so 41 investors in that fund, 32 were women. Many of them had never been invited to invest in a startup before. Some of them, when I asked them, they said to me, me? Like me as a startup investor? And meanwhile, I was thinking, like, these were people who had a wealth of business and entrepreneurial experience. You know, they had led other organizations, they had started small businesses, or they had worked in large corporates, but no one had ever asked them to invest in a startup. And so they thought, not me. But that invitation had a snowball effect. Some of my investors went on to invest in other startups. One of them now leads the Strategic Investment Fund in BC. Another started her own fund. I feel like I've passed the baton. And it created like a whole new community of investors who otherwise would have been shut out from this ecosystem. And the ecosystem would have missed out on their expertise and their knowledge and their wisdom. So sometimes it's important to simply start and invite people in. The other key thing around starting something new is to ask for help. And I kind of alluded to this in the opening. In my experience, starting my company in BC was one of the best things I could have done because it was so community-oriented. I kind of miss it. I moved back to Toronto in 2019, and I can blame the pandemic a little bit. Like, finding that sense of community has eluded me a little bit in Toronto. But in Vancouver, there was this culture of helping each other. Like, one of my other sort of top tips is, like, when you're building something, whether it's a startup, whether it's you're carving out a corporate path, like, you do need to run your own race. It can be very alluring to compare your success to others, but at the end of the day, we are forging our own path. But to forge your own path in community, we can't do this stuff on our own. It's hard. We need resources. We need support. We need people to help see around corners, because we can't possibly know everything. So one of my best lessons, I guess, that I learned, and one of my best advice is, if you're going to start something, ask for help. Do it in a community. You might feel like you can get farther faster on your own, but you'll be more resilient if you do it in community with others. Which brings me to my next point, which is there's bound to be obstacles, there's bound to be setbacks and challenges. I've lost count of how many obstacles or challenges I faced, and each time, like, it is hard. What I've learned is that, like, there are barriers sometimes. Stuff happens. There are mistakes. There are things that will feel like desperate failure. But I've also learned to feel that sadness, the grief of something not quite working out the way I expected to. The feeling of loss sometimes. It's perfectly normal and natural to feel grief and sadness and sometimes despair. You cannot ignore that. But once you've done that, once you've given that the space, like, you don't need to dwell on it. But now you have created the space to then open yourself up to the possibilities. And what is the pivot? What is the next path? When is it time to just close up shop and do something else entirely? That is okay too. Because again, like, these, you are running your own race. No one knows what you're going through but yourself. And you're responsible for your own decisions. And so sometimes the right decision is also to stop. Sometimes the right decision is to not fight the war, but to try to win the battle. Sometimes the problems out there are not for you to solve individually, but for us to solve collectively. And so we also need to know when to press pause, when to pivot, or when to try to tackle the problem in a different way. Which leaves me with where I am now and this vast world of sustainable finance and sustainable investment. I'm going to take a risk, and I'm just going to throw a little bit of chaos into the room, because sustainability is a very wide topic. By day, my role at Mercer is focused on a particular part of the sustainable finance ecosystem. We advise pension funds, endowments, foundations, and insurance companies. Those entities do not have to raise money from other investors. They have a pool of assets that are either funded by pension contributions, by donations, by insurance premiums, and they are literally allocating that money towards different opportunities, which is a very different mindset still from, say, funds, right? So you might have heard of fund managers or asset managers or investment managers, or sometimes they're called intermediaries. Those entities are also investors, but they raise money from that first category of institutional investor. Their incentives are very different. Their objectives are different. But they are identifying the companies to invest in, public or private. They're identifying possibly other funds to invest in. And then you have companies that are also paying attention to sustainability and what it means to have a sustainable business model. And all of these participants in the sustainable investment and finance space, again, have different objectives, different ideas of what risk means, different approaches to managing risk. And so when I speak about sustainable investment, or when anyone speaks about sustainable investment or finance, it's really helpful to ask, like, what do you mean? Which part of the ecosystem? What tools do you have available to you? What levers do you have to pull? The other thing I want to say about sustainability, sustainable investment, and make the connection to math. So there is value in modeling, mathematical models, to try to connect climate and sustainability and environmental data, even social data, to financial data. But the models in and of themselves are not useful on their own. At the end of the day, the information has to be meaningful to shift someone's decision. And so we had some conversations earlier today around, climate modeling, scenario analysis, different mathematical models, but trying to link it to actually solving a problem, to asking questions of your particular audience to understand what problem is it that they're actually trying to solve. And in my experience, particularly over the last 10 years, it's been critical to know how to ask those questions to draw out what the real issues are. And to marry the numbers with the words so that there's also a narrative, a story to shift people's minds. Recall what I said earlier, like it's not just analysis, it's emotions that drive people's decisions. So when you're working with a mathematical model, like it has to have meaning to someone. Like someone has to know, like, is this good or bad? Do I keep going with what I'm doing, or do I stop? Do I shift direction, or do I need to gather more information? So keep that in mind in the context of sustainable finance and investment, because it is still an evolving space where there's new data and decision makers are trying to make sense of it. They're trying to figure out, like, how does that influence my decisions when I'm so used to these financial models, these models of financial risk and return that I'm so used to. Another concept in sustainability, which is underrepresented. People are currently asking questions about it, but it's probably a bit underserved at the moment, and that is the social side of sustainability. And a friend of mine who is in Vancouver recently reminded me, and this was actually a key concept in the book that I wrote called Integrated Investing. In finance, it's not just about making the most returns and managing the risk. There is a social side of that equation, which is who gets to benefit from those returns? Who is bearing the risk? And so when I wrote my book, Integrated Investing, I explored this concept of access to essential resources. Who gets access to resources to survive, thrive, and be happy? It isn't just solely about, again, making as much money as you can. It's also thinking about who gets to participate as an investor, who actually gets to generate income from capital as well as from their labor. And so many of my friends are now starting to think about, the justice side of sustainable finance. How is sustainable finance contributing to inequality or equality? Another layer to add to the conversation if you're contemplating how to integrate sustainability in what you do. So I've covered a lot. It's really only scratching the surface. I'm sure that there's some questions in the room, but I thought I'd just close. The hands have gone up already. But I thought I'd at least just close. If you're thinking about starting something, I encourage you to just start. Yes, there's risks, but we need your ideas out in the world. The second is have a support network. Don't do it on your own. Make sure you have the support resources around you. So you have sounding boards, so you can to help you navigate through complexity, through the ups and downs. And at the same time, like, you are running your own race. It can be very tempting to compare to others, but do also stay true to what's right for you. And so I'll just close with, I hope this has piqued your curiosity, and I encourage you to have a positive impact. Thanks.
Thank you for your enlightening talk. So you mentioned sustainable finance, and there are the ESG goals. People have heard about the ESG like models, but how do you? It's kind of hard to quantify you know, like, I mean, even environmental like, kind of like assessments, you know, a lot of them are like just like made up or like mumbo jumbo. Then you go into the kind of social, and then it's even harder to kind of like quantify it and having accurate base metrics to even go there. I mean, like, where do you like stand on that? And what sort of base metrics do you use for each of these possible ESG goals, metrics?
Yeah, there's actually a lot in that question because, so ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors, is a framework. You can look it up, there's the different definitions for that, but in my thinking, with a math background, like it's a container for organizing, call it non-financial or extra financial data that could have a financial impact. So just bear in mind, ESG, it's a framework. That's one thing. Second thing is, working with that information at the end of the day, like, is a model, right? So it's not fact or reality. It's a way for us to try to create a depiction of how those factors could impact something else. In sustainable finance, it's financial risk and return. Thirdly, there's not consensus in terms of, thirdly, I'll say there's not consensus in terms of what factors to measure. However, there are increasingly widely adopted frameworks around some of those metrics, namely climate metrics. So there is broad adoption around measuring carbon footprint or measuring the carbon intensity, so what an investment portfolio is financing in terms of carbon footprint. So hold that thought, like there is widely accepted frameworks for that. Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, it's being absorbed into an international standard setting body. But it's a model, right? It doesn't necessarily capture like real world impact. And so in my book, one of the things I explored, and I actually did this with Peak Fund, right? Like I was cognizant of how do we measure impact and like, what do we mean? How do we communicate that? When we can experience impact, that is the most compelling, but it's the least scalable and it's the least universally communicable, right? So for example, I will always credit the cooperative program here at Waterloo as being really impactful to me. My parents had no connections. I had very little exposure to career opportunities, but coming to Waterloo, being part of a cooperative program, exposed me to a lot more opportunities. That literally had a positive impact on me. And it was experiential, right? So what's the next stage of communicating impact? It's through stories, because they evoke that sense of like, oh, if you didn't experience that impact, if you hear a story about somebody experiencing that impact, you might also feel impacted by that. The third way of communicating impact is through numbers. It's far more scalable, but it's also far more extracted. So I take your point, right? Like there's a lot of, call it risk and uncertainty around these extra financial measures, ESG factors that, you can't quite see the direct impact on financial measures, which have been adopted and accepted for quite some time. But they are a way of modeling what that impact could be, and it's far more scalable to communicate. So my caution there, which is, I also mentioned before, it's not just the numbers, it's also being able to have that narrative to tell the story about what those numbers mean to be able to influence decisions. Because at the end of the day, measuring ESG factors, like why are we doing that? It's to try to identify what the impact is and to shift decisions around what we're doing.
Thanks. So my question is about the social aspect of ESG. Me and my colleagues, I'm a current UW undergrad. We are initiating a project related to neurodiversity and mental health. That is, I believe, a very important part of ESG. But it's very difficult to make it profitable and sustainable because, we are just throwing money and resources into this project. And lots of people, they love this topic. They are willing to offer help. But, it's very difficult to develop a sustainable business model, whether we are trying to be an event organizer or a mental health illness founder. It's very difficult for us to really be influential, and that is exactly our goal. But it's very challenging, and as we are just starting, we see that we are dedicating ourselves into this very important field, but it's so challenging, and we have to convince others, or founders, or potential founders, to believe that we can get to achieve this high. Sometimes I feel alone, and I wonder how to push these things in ESG field. They are not profitable, and if we make it profitable, it's very likely it will not be ethical. It's a dilemma for me. So I wonder how you feel about this. Thank you.
There's a lot of questions in that one as well. But firstly, I agree with you. Mental health or resources to support people in the area of mental health is so critical. I actually think there's a lot of applications for it. We can talk about that later. I think actually, there's some connections between climate change, call it energy transition. I think mental health also plays a part of that because there's a lot of identity wrapped up in some of the most extractive industries. But anyhow, we can talk about that later. Couple of things I heard in that, right? So yeah, it's a high bar. It's a high bar to create something that is both economically viable as well as positively impactful. But it's possible. Part of it comes from the belief that it is possible and that you're striving for both. So when I'll share a bit of a story. So when I started Peak Fund, as I said, in hindsight, it was a little bit, maybe I was a bit naive starting a startup fund, an impact VC fund, requires some resources. It's a bit of a long game. It doesn't generate returns very quickly in the early years. And also an impact standard at this time where there weren't a lot of impact ventures and impact funds. But I started with a thesis of I was going to do this and I was going to generate a return in a thoughtful way for my investors. Because I didn't want to lose their money. If I was going to lose, I did warn them that there was risk, right? But if I was going to just take their money and they're not going to get it back, that is philanthropy. I set a goal to create a fund that would generate returns and measurable impact. I narrowed it down in terms of what impact I could have. I also, in hindsight, I kind of didn't really know that I was doing this at the time, but I have a word for it now, and that was also diversification of the impact. I've had 2 exits from that fund so far, and one of them was impact oriented, but also I knew would be financially lucrative enough to help me return money to my investors as well. So it was helpful for the entrepreneur as well as for my investors. So having the mindset of this is going to be helpful, I'm just going to paraphrase, provide mental health services in an economically viable way, start with that mindset and then find the business model that fits that. Because the other part, which is practical advice for anyone starting a venture, is to work out, okay, who is your customer for that? Is it the people who need the services? Do they have the resources to pay for it? Because if they don't, they're probably not your customer. But is there somebody else, some other entity, some other customer who is willing to pay to make those resources, those services available? Then that's your customer. So part of it has to do with having the right business model and doing that customer discovery and development to ensure you are actually talking to the right customer who can pay for that. Second row.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I'm glad you're here because I was trying to figure out, and the way you were explaining your background is where I'm planning to go. So I run a clean tech startup and it's doing well. And we had an investor who wanted to invest in our company, but we didn't need the money. So I told him we don't need the money. And I thought that would be the end of the conversation. But he wanted exposure to Waterloo startups, especially like clean tech startups. So he has told me to set up a VC fund focused on Waterloo, and he will come in as an initial LP to that fund. So I would now have to fundraise for that fund. So I would love to get your advice specifically around VC funding, especially because you've done it yourself, and any advice along that.
My first question is, do you want to? Do you want to start a fund?
I think so, because I've been involved in the startup ecosystem and I never had my own capital to invest. So I almost feel I couldn't help like my friends who were starting companies. So this is a great way, sure, to give returns to the investor, but also as a way to help founders, because I remember getting the first check is the hardest check to get. So if we can help them initially, I feel it would be a great deal for the investor, but it would also help the startup ecosystem as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's great if you have this connection and someone wants to seed a fund. A fund is a business at the end of the day with a very particular business model, particular customer, particular sort of supply side of it. And so, you know, I don't know what stage you're at in terms of your thinking about it, but it's almost no different from thinking through another startup, right? Like, there's actually some tools in the book that I wrote in terms of what are the pieces that you need to think about, right? Like, what is that business model for that fund? How connected are you up and down the supply chain for the fund? I.e., you have one investor identified, but can you identify others? What is your thesis for the fund? Which is essentially the value proposition for it? There's some other factors. And so, you know, without knowing exactly what stage you're at with that thinking, I think like, you know, doing the homework in terms of what it would take to start a fund, and do you really want to do that? Do you have a differentiated enough value proposition? Can help you on that next step. Or maybe I'll get around to finishing the second book that I was going to write, and then you can read that book and they'll have lots of advice on how to get started with a fund.
In a corporate world, the life that you make is like steps that you take towards your future. So like, I mean, I guess that's in any career, but it's very much like you have full control. How did you move towards a venture fund where you kind of let go of part of that control in order to succeed?
That's an interesting question. This concept of control, like, I'm not sure I could say I have full control in either situation. And it's really interesting having returned to a corporate environment, bringing my entrepreneurial skills. Like, I have a better appreciation of the different relationships I need to forge and the different people I need to bring along on the journey. Now, I don't think I could say this, you know, before starting Peak Ventures, like if I was in my corporate job. Like, I think I can only say this having experienced having my own business. And I think it actually makes me more effective in my corporate role. Like, I do think of my sustainable investment practice at Mercer like a business. I just happen to have this smallish town called Mercer, and it's, you know, it's part of a bigger county called Marsh McLennan. Like, there's a whole bunch of distribution partners. There's, you know, I have access to clients in a way that I would have had to build if I was running my own business. So, on the one hand, I don't have control over everything, whether it's my own business or in a corporate environment, because there's still different decision makers I either need to influence or have other partners that I need to bring along with me. I have, you know, teams, I have different people that I need to get on board with a vision and a strategy. I don't have full control over all that. I can set out some steps, and I can see, even this concept of control, I think it's like a little bit mythical. Like, I can take steps to make real a plan, but I can't control other people's decisions, but I can create the conditions to make it more likely that people will support an idea or move in the same direction. So, yeah, even when I had my own business, like, you know, I was still dependent on whether it was like consulting clients or investors. Like, I needed to meet their objectives as well. I did not have full control over their decision making. But I learned enough to be able to control the steps to try to make that happen, if that makes sense.
I'm told the food is ready, so we'll take this first question and then we'll transition to our next.
I will add just on the control thing, because like I grew up in an environment where, like, surrounded by fairly risk-averse people. Like, my parents, they took risks to immigrate to Canada, and then after that, it was like, no more risks. Like, they were just probably quite traumatized by the whole experience. And my dad is always asking me, like, are you okay? Like, is your job secure? Like, do you have enough money? And like, I try to explain to him, like, nothing is really secure. This idea of security is a bit mythical, but I am equipped. Like, I know how to bounce back from adversity. Like, if something doesn't go the way I planned, like, it can feel a bit scary, but again, like, I have the support network and I have the knowledge to try to figure out, okay, what's the pivot? What's the path forward? How do I manage those risks? There's always risk. Okay, how do I create the right conditions to keep going? So I thought I'd just add that too. Go ahead, sorry.
Amazing, thank you. So I've been doing research with SEED at the Faculty of Environment for a little over a year now. And so recently, like, we've just been working on industry papers. A challenge we're really running into, though, is being able to convince people that impact investing or sustainability is something that they should take part in, even though it might be less profitable in certain situations. And specifically, our research is in divestment away from oil and gas companies in pension funds in the United States and North America. And that's something that's apparently very polarizing when I talked about it on social media. So I was wondering, like, what are you doing in order to be able to persuade people that even though it might be less profitable in the short term, like how, like, the long-term impacts and future profitability, or how are you able to convince, like, investors and other stakeholders?
For your context, Bonnie, SEED is the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development in the Faculty of Environment.
Yeah, big question. So where do I start with that? So convincing people who don't want to be convinced is impossible. I learned that from trying to raise money, right? Like, raising money for a fund, if they really don't want to invest in my funds, like, there's nothing I can do to convince them. If impact investing is of no interest to them, like, move on. Secondly, so again, I learned this from running my own business, right? Asking questions around, okay, what is somebody's objectives? What's their vision? What are their drivers? And you want to try to find that common ground and that same language and same direction. The funny thing with divestment, it is very polarizing. Some people, like I am exposed to communities of folks that are like, you know, deep in the divestment and like in divestment camp, and like folks who are at the forefront of, you know, change. They're engaging with investors on very specific issues. Like it's like a whole different community than this other group, which is more focused on engagement. They don't like divestment. Okay, as a consultant, like I end up talking to both. And I support them based on what is important to them, what are their needs. But I'll tell you one thing, like investors don't really have an issue with reallocating money. And so there's also a case to be made that there's opportunities for good risk-adjusted returns if they reallocated their money to something else. So terminology and language and speaking in a way of like, you know what, like this is just good, this is like, there's opportunity here, good risk-adjusted returns. It's just sensible to reallocate your money over there. Investors have no problem reallocating. But the word divestment is, right, because there is an emotional driver behind that. I'll bring this up now. Like I actually think, you know, there needs to be a lot of supports and a safety, like a soft landing for shifting from extractive energy to renewable energy. I think more mental health supports for that is important, because there's a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on that, a lot of people whose identity depends on that. I have another theory in terms of how those industries were formed and won. That is probably a conversation over drinks and cocktails. But yeah, I think just the divestment conversation is challenging, because people will just put up a wall and stop listening. So if you want to have an impact and if you want success, you need to ask what are the drivers, what's important to them, speak in their language, and you might actually accomplish the same thing you set out to, but it takes a slightly different form, if that makes sense. But also, like, it's also, yeah, there might be other things influencing it too, like, right? Like, people are very attached to the identity of oil and gas.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bonnie. This has been so insightful
Thank
and
you.
inspirational, and I love that you keep tying back your knowledge and insights to your time at Waterloo and the skills that you developed here.
Thank you.
We have a small gift for you, if everyone could just join me in showing our appreciation to Bonnie. Just a token of our appreciation. And for the audience,
you.
Math Innovation also has a gift for some of you. If you look at the tickets that you got for the reception, if there is I believe it's a heart sticker on the back as well as the front, we have purchased a few copies of Bonnie's book to share with some of our attendees, and we also have a few for purchase as well. So thank you again. We're going to transition over to the networking break where there's bubble tea and some refreshments. But if you've been here before, you know that we do one more thing before we leave. It's completely optional, but we'd love to take a photograph of Bonnie with the folks that have come. So what we found works best is if folks stand kind of in the center here.